what I'm going to speak about today is an intersection of science and Eastern contemplative traditions. And the subject, as Catherine Ann described, was the idea of what's called yoga nidra. So in short, I'm going to start to go into that in a little bit greater depth, but I want to introduce a couple ideas first. But in short, what yoga nidra means is yoga we could translate as awareness or experience or union, and sleep translates, or excuse me, nidra translates as sleep. So yoga nidra is a practice that's really more than we see it in various texts that are more than 1,000 years old. So it's been around for quite some time, and we're at a kind of interesting juncture now as it relates to the needs to our culture and our society and how technology has impacted so many of us, that I really think we stand at a turning point in yoga nidra becoming a significant contributor to keeping us sane and healthy. And so I want to just, before I start to go into the subject directly, I actually would like to ask you one or two things. First of all, how many of you feel absolutely rested? Absolutely rested. Okay, so I would guess from where I'm standing that's less than 5%, which is probably accurate. Now I'm going to ask you, that was the easy one. Now I'm going to ask you a harder one. And that is, what's the purpose of life? I'll give you a little time, as much as you need. What is the purpose of life? And I'm going to speak to that. Really, that's what this whole conversation is, and hopefully what I can contribute to this gathering. In short, what I would tell you is that the purpose of life is twofold. Number one, to learn how not to suffer, to have less suffering. And number two would be to contribute to the world what it is that you are precisely gifted to contribute, to find your purpose. And we saw it on this first really extraordinary film you shared with us, Glenda. And that's what the gentleman said. He said, as long as you are alive, you have a purpose. So I would say that that is the purpose of life, is number one, to figure out how to suffer less, and number two, how to find your unique purpose. Indeed, part two of that is the subject of my book, The Four Desires. But it's the first one I want to speak a little bit about today, and in how this conjuncts, what's the conjunction of that idea and yoga nidra. Really, if we think about it, we think that all of the developments we've seen in civilization, from the kind of capturing of harnessing of fire, what we did to electricity, and to the neurology that we celebrate so much of here in ASPENBRAINLAB, to engineering, to architecture, to all of it, in a way, is to help us suffer less. All of these advents of technology, indeed, are to serve a purpose, which is to help us, in a way, move toward having more fulfillment. Now, in the Eastern tradition of this idea, there's really two fundamental approaches to this, and two kind of focuses. One focus of having more or less suffering, let's say more pleasure or less suffering, more fulfillment, less suffering, would be to master the outside world. And so that is what civilization has done so brilliantly, and in many ways the West has spearheaded. We're kind of the tip of the spear in this, and that is this incredible build-up and how we continue to kind of snowball this whole development of technology. Is really quite extraordinary. And so the principle of that is that on a worldly level, we continue to get more fulfilled. We have more at our disposal, we have more freedom, we have more, as it were, choices. The Eastern tradition, however, says, but there's an entirely different way to accumulate knowledge and develop knowledge over time, and it doesn't lead to circumstantial happiness. It leads to lasting fulfillment. It leads to not circumstantial happiness, but lasting fulfillment. And how do we gain knowledge that allows us to be less at the mercy of circumstances to determine our happiness? This is actually the introduction to the concept and to the discussion of yoga nidra. In a way, it's really compelling to us to say, what do I have to know in order to touch upon lasting fulfillment? Now, something that modern science and these ancient seers have in common is the understanding that your senses are relatively weak when it comes to perceiving reality. Your senses, your five senses, what they see, what we hear, taste, touch, and smell, is about, well, the most optimistic studies I've seen about this is that you and I perceive about 8% of reality. So there's 92% of reality that's kind of just not being recognized. The less optimistic studies say that we see about 1.001% of reality. So right now, in the context of just this moment, you and I are seeing somewhere between 1/100th of 1% or possibly 8% of really what's occurring at this moment. That's kind of bad news if you're looking to fulfill the purpose of your life, which is to have more pleasure, because you're seeing very little. And this is the bad news. The good news is you sleep. Even if you don't sleep a lot, you sleep. And the ancient tradition held the idea of this, is that when you slept, you stepped into another world. Not a world of confusion or darkness, but actually a world in which discovery was a possibility, boundless discovery. So the setup for that is the idea that even when when we're awake, we're at the mercy of our five senses plus our rational mind. In other words, we make up decisions and thoughts around the world based on those five senses and what they tell us. Right? So we get 5% of the evidence. I'm now averaging things out here. Maybe 4, maybe 2% of the evidence, and we make decisions about who we are, what's important, where we're going, the future of our life, what we need to fight for, what we don't need to fight for, what we need to react to, et cetera, based on 2% and then our limited learning. On the other hand, they said, and now what happens in dreams is just a kind of processing of those various experiences and projections, and so we're still within the confines of our five senses, aren't we? But what the seers recognized was that when you sleep, it all disappears. The doctor earlier spoke so eloquently and so comprehensively about the value of sleep, and he spoke about it in a physiological context. But now I'm going to speak about a little bit in terms of a psychological, emotional, and even spiritual context. That sleep provides us a window into boundlessness. The problem is that when we're sleeping, we're not seeing that we're resting in boundlessness. This is, in fact, what many sciences have now tried to do, is develop instruments for seeing what we don't normally see. So where we think about the particle accelerator in Switzerland, or we even saw the few cartoons about how the brain is processing and digesting toxins when you sleep, we're developing instruments that see beyond what our five senses can see. But still, we're at the mercy of comprehending what we're seeing based on what we're seeing through our five senses. So even that cartoon I had to perceive through my five senses. So now what I want to offer is that the yogis literally developed a way to have it the best of both worlds, which is to remain conscious while sleeping. And that's what they called Yoga Nidra. Yoga Nidra basically is a way of fundamentally relaxing very deeply. Now, here's the news, and if I don't have a lot of time to speak about this very rich subject today. But so what I would tell you is that Yoga Nidra itself is the intersection of the deepest state of meditation combined with deep sleep. Physiologically, what it ultimately means is that you are in the non-REM, deep wave, slow wave sleep. You're in that stage the doctor was telling us about where physiologically there's tremendous repair going on. There's all of this kind of pruning of memory and all of the vital reserves that are occurring. Well, that's what we're going to enter through Yoga Nidra. I didn't hear you speak to the idea that, one thing that should be said, although dream, the process of nature and adaptation has allowed sleep to be what it is, but the fact is it's relatively ineffective when it comes to deep sleep. And by that, again, I mean slow wave, the third stage of deep sleep. The deepest sleep actually only occurs about 20% to 25% over 8 hours. We heard how 8 hours is ideal, but only about 20% of it is in this deep sleep. Well, the yogis found ways to deeply relax that would generate that same slow wave deep sleep within 10 to 15 minutes. So that means that within, let's say 30 minutes to 40 minutes of this process, you gain something like 20% of what you need in terms of deep sleep over a night. In other words, if you do a session of Yoga Nidra in about 40 minutes, you get about an eighth or a sixth of what you need. Now, I don't know if this is true, and I went up to try and ask the doctor at the break about this, but not so long ago, I read in the New York Times talked about phases of sleep. And instead of necessarily having to get 8 to 9 hours every night, that if we got 6 to 7 and then took a nap, it would have the same beneficial effect as if we slept 9. And you're shaking your head in the affirmative. Is that correct? So this is where Yoga Nidra really comes in a very pragmatic sense, incredibly usefully. Because in that lull that most of us experience around 2 to 3, that's not just because your coffee is worn out. The fact is that there is a physiological phase where you need to sleep more. You need another little sleep. And there's a startling statistic around when the Spanish gave up siestas. Within 8 years, they did studies on this, and the incidence of heart attacks went up 66% in men. Men actually more susceptible to heart attacks. In other words, when they weren't sleeping and taking their naps in the afternoon, I'm giving you permission to take a nap. But more importantly, I will invite you to do Yoga Nidra during that time because of how quickly it allows us to enter this place of deep sleep. And now within Yoga Nidra, interestingly, there are actually processes that are somewhat similar to dreaming, that you actually allow yourself to consciously dream. So how much time do I have, actually? I didn't look what time it was when I came up. Can someone tell me?
You have 7 minutes.
7 minutes. It's a lifetime. So let me tell you, there has not been a lot of research, but this is very much a science-based discussion. My grand teacher was one of the first and only masters of this science to be tested in a laboratory. And this was early days of EEGs and EKGs, and in the late 70s, he did these tests at the Menninger Institute in Kansas. And he defied, at the time, scientists' understanding of what was possible. So by all measures, he was sleeping. He would do this practice, and he would tell them, listen, while I'm in this state of sleep, I will be fully conscious of what's happening in the environment. I said, no, you won't be. Because that is one of the key symptoms, if you will, of sleeping, is that there may be noises going on and sirens going on, and if you live in a city or your kids are making noise or the dogs are barking next door, and if you're sleeping deeply, you're unaware of it. So he said, I'll be aware of that. So by all measures, they gave him a chance to do this practice, which is, again, doesn't take very long to enter, and it's really simple. That's the real beauty of it, and I want to emphasize that point before I finish. And he dropped into this state, and they say, by all measures, predominant delta wave pattern, he's asleep. Well, as prearranged, the scientist had a conversation in the room while he was sleeping. After coming out of the state, he told them verbatim what they had said. He had heard everything, and yet, by all measures, he was asleep. And he said, but that's only part of it. Let's do something else. I'll do the practice again, but this time be in a different room. They said, a different room. You won't be able to hear us. He said it didn't matter. So they did the process. They went into, I guess, again, you can read about this. It's all been documented. They went into a room, other soundproofing in between him and them. They had another conversation. He was in the state of sleep, and he told them what they said, verbatim. So what this means is that our 5 senses are limited. It's kind of unacceptable or very hard to fathom that someone could not only be asleep and hear people, but he could hear people in a place where his senses couldn't normally perceive it anyway. And what it suggests is that you and I see very little of reality. And that as we begin to disengage with our senses, we begin to activate awareness, intelligence, or consciousness, And this is where, in a sense, science is really just making the most interesting discoveries around, and this is still the big question in science, I believe, is what is consciousness? What is the physiology of consciousness? What is it, and how does it differ from brain? We would argue that brain is the instrument of consciousness. That's from the Eastern contemplative traditions. So, in short, I just want to again just wrap things up. Here's what I'd like to just say in closing around this idea, and that is that it is through the quietude in the mind that it makes it possible for us to perceive what normally we don't perceive. Again, from the tradition of the East, it suggests that our inherent nature is creativity. Our inherent nature is capacity. Our inherent nature is intuition. And now science has actually shown us that when we become stressful, the brain goes into a default mode called exploitation, which means that we keep looping the information that we have operated from in the past. When we become stressed, our brain circulates what we already know and reuses it and reapplies it again and again and again. When we become relaxed, when we begin to stimulate or activate delta patterns and do it consciously, not just through sleep, sleep is deeply meaningful, but when we begin to do it either through meditation or through yoga nidra, what I'm making the case for today, what I like to call enlightened sleep, the brain shifts into its normative pattern, which is exploration. And Glenda, we celebrate the idea of creative brain here. What I would say is the brain by default is creative. Your brain by default solves problems. That's its nature. And it does so in ever new and creative ways. But it can only do so when you relax. That's the science of this. So having said that, what I would suggest, and I was having some conversations last night in preparation for today with some of the members of the board and some of their friends and supporters. And I don't know if I had one conversation with anyone who said, how do I sleep more? How can you help? What does this say? With regular practice, this thing called enlightened sleep allows us to trigger enough of the parasympathetic response, which we've also heard about today, so that in time you begin to change the direction. You begin to create a kind of operative balance in your nervous system, autonomic nervous system, that allows you to rest and sleep more deeply. Also, enlightened sleep or yoga nidra can be used as a way to prepare for sleep. And let me make that last suggestion, make that last point as I leave you. To sleep deeply is not just a physiological phenomenon, it's also a psychological or mental phenomenon. And by that I mean, we've all experienced moments in our life where we've been physically tired, but mentally activated. Other times we're mentally exhausted, but physically stimulated. And both speak to the idea that it's difficult to fall asleep. Whether we're physically tired and mentally active, or mentally tired and physically active. So somehow we need the cooperation or the integration of the mind and the body to sleep deeply. I was taught that in order to sleep deeply, you have to prepare for sleep. And something that we can all do, I have some people coming tomorrow, but something that we can all do is as you get into bed, take 5 to 10 minutes, never mind, we put the phones away now, but simply slow down your breath consciously. And within 5 minutes, you will feel a dramatic shift. That's where you begin to set really the stage to be able to sleep deeply. And then finally, we can also use sleep when we learn how to bring awareness with it to discover there is more to us than we see in the mirror. I want to again thank you, Glenda, and thank you to the ASPENBRAINLAB. Thank you very much.